Hello everybody, I am back! So I did not plan on being gone for this long. As it turns out, I have a whole slew of medical issues I need to take care of. School has been rough, the usual spiel. Frankly, I just want to get back to the video right now. Anyways, who wants to talk about French identitarianism? No? Alright, fine. But we're starting our story off with Vichy France. Never heard of it? No problem. So, let's talk about how everything got this way. How did Vichy France spawn into existence? Well, in 1940, during World War II, France was invaded by Nazi Germany and forced to sign an armistice, which is basically surrender, but sort of not. So let's go over the changes that happened to the nation of France as a result of this. At this time, Germany had achieved the Anschluss, or annexation of Austria, as well as the annexation of the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, also Poland. This was because these places had a lot of ethnic Germans in them, so they wanted to unite them. Next, to invade France, they navigated around it and beat the snot out of the Low Countries. France fell. These are the changes. Both the Netherlands and Belgium would come under fascist control, installing new pro-German governments in them. Luxembourg would also be completely annexed into Germany, convincing them that they were not part of a unique identity, but were just Germans. This new fascist Belgium would also annex this northern chunk in France. As for France itself, Germany annexes Alsace-Lorraine, Alsace-Lothringen. Next up, the Nazis set up an occupied zone in the north of France, technically military occupation, which included Paris and the entire Atlantic coastline. This was for defense against any naval invasions and was a no-go zone for French people. Italy, another Axis country and friend of Germany, also joined in. They invaded a tiny bit in the southeast of France, in the French Riviera, and were given a small zone of influence as well, which they occupied, choosing to directly annex small pockets of it and add to the greater spaghetti motherland. What a participation trophy. Teehee. Also, the island of Corsica, which used to belong to France, and still does, by the way, was annexed by Italy to make sure that Sardinia and Sicily weren't lonely. Not really. There was also a zone carved out to plan for German colonization in the northeast, which went nowhere. Anyway, this leaves behind Vichy France, the chunk in the south that remained independent. It was a fascist puppet state of the Nazis, like the others, but still remained technically independent, able to do their own stuff, but holistically answer to someone else. But come on, does this flag look fascist to you? Yes! So what was going on with Vichy France? Here's a map, glad you asked. Their capital was up here, in the city of Vichy, hence the name of the country. Now, the reason Vichy was picked as the capital of this new frickin' French fascist force and not a larger city, say Lyon or Marseille, was because Vichy had a lot of hotels to accommodate and quarter the German forces, as well as a fairly modern telephone system to make communication amongst Axis-ites easier. The city also had hot springs. So how was Vichy France run? What was going on with the government? So the primary purpose of creating this puppet state in the first place was twofold. One, the Germans lacked both the resources and the men to govern and control literally all of France and its large globe-spanning empire, so they found it easiest to break it up into occupied zones and territories, and also make a fake puppet government to make it appear to the British that their so-called former ally had betrayed them and switched sides. How devious. But who was running the show from behind the scenes? The official leader of Vichy France was Marshal Philippe Pétain, full name, Henri-Philippe Benoni-Omer Pétain, a World War I general who was kind of thrusted into the position of Nazi collaborator. Now, to find out how someone accidentally just stumbles into that position, let's save that for a bit later first, and discuss his life so that we can fully get a grasp on it. So Pétain was born in 1856 to poor farmers in northern France. His family had a history of serving in the military, and little Philippe's grandfather would often tell him stories of serving in Napoleon's army when he was younger. This inspired the little boy to eventually imitate that and continue his family's military services. Throughout his youth, he would mostly attend the the Saint-Cyr Military Academy in northwestern France. Also, this school has an insane track record. If there's a French military figure in the modern era, they almost definitely won here. Good job, guys. Anywho, throughout much of his youth in that school as a young man, he was outdoors a lot in an Alpine regiment, where he showed great enthusiasm and courage, despite living under the grody mud, sweat, and BO of his unwashed future soldier mates in the wild for extended periods of time. He was very much liked because of this, and is believed to be where his militaristic gifts came from. Now, as an adult, he became very conservative, believing in a strong French identity and strong, hard-hitting war assaults, instead of dancing around them with coordination and espionage and whatnot. Just straight-up army-to-army huge assaults. This is called foreshadowing. After a fun stint in Morocco, it was time for war. By the time the First World War came around, he was 58 years old, and finally achieved the rank of general. He trained Charles de Gaulle, who took a shine for the old guy. If you're a history buff, you already know the irony here. Anyway, he did well throughout much of the war until the Battle of Verdun, which I may do a video on one day. Verdun was one of the biggest battles in human history because of just how long and brutal it was, and it was in 1916, basically France versus the German Empire. Now, the Germans were really good in World War I. I mean, really. Heck, the Central Powers almost won the war until the Yanks showed up. However, they were no match for Pétain. He was basically told that it was hopeless, but he remained unwavered. He was an inspirational cat as well, able to rally up his French troops at a time when living in pits of mustard gas and diarrhea would really demoralize a man. Not only that, but he also made good use of artillery and transport lines, letting the French win the battle. After the war ended, Pétain was a well-liked and very respected hero to the Frenchies and the trenchies, looking up to him as a symbol of military might. However, Pétain, not so much. He was in shambles, recovering from an exhausting war. He also was majorly disapproving of the direction France was heading in, seeking to demilitarize a bit and dispose of their geared-up military attitude. Pétain pleaded with the government many times to ramp up their military again, but they wouldn't listen. In fact, he was the one who came up with the Maginot Line. World War II, let's do it. France gets invaded. We discussed this whole thing before, so let's skip to the part where he shakes hands with Hitler. Now listen closely, because this gets kind of interesting. So before France officially collapsed to the Nazis, their ally Britain told them to continue their fight, because if the Nazis gained control over strategic French port cities, the British would be forced to bomb and destroy them so that they aren't used for malice and screwing over the Allies. Pétain felt betrayed by this, seeing the country he loved being invaded, and his so-called ally threatening to kaboom his country's cities. Now obviously, you can make a case for the Brits here, but think about how Pétain and the French must have felt, being backed into a corner in an already shoddy situation. This feeling of betrayal was another factor that led to Pétain wanting to kind of join the Axis, but not entirely. Now, I read this part online, but I felt I should leave this in. So right before France capitulated, Pétain was dining at a restaurant, and in that very same restaurant was Charles de Gaulle also eating. They spotted each other and shook hands, never seeing each other again. So the president of France has resigned, and decided to put Pétain in his place instead. By this time, Pétain was already 84 years old when he was given leadership. However, he didn't use his amazing war skills to valiantly defeat the Germans, he surrendered. He signed an armistice with them. General and resistance leader Charles de Gaulle fled the country to London. Meanwhile, Pétain was appointed dictator of Vichy France by the Nazis. Here's that photo where Pétain shook hands with Mustache Man himself. As part of the terms of surrender, Pétain was given absolute power over the new country, making him a pro-Axis dictator. The reason he was kept in charge by the Nazis was because he was exactly the material they were looking for. Very conservative, militaristic alpha male, and wanted to re-energize what he believed to be a wuss version of France into one with a strong ethnic identity, reinstating the nation's identity to that of a hardcore Catholic and French nationalist nation. He opposed the Germans and the Axis, but he opposed the degradation of his country even more. This way, to him, this was choosing the lesser of two evils. Pétain did kind of get indoctrinated by the fascist ideology now, however. He had a bitterness towards France's government because he believed it was responsible for his nation's downfall. The Axists who believed in strong nationalism were now in charge, which he saw as not being the worst thing in the world since they could reinvigorate France. The flag changed, the anthem changed from La Marseillaise to Marshal, and the Constitution was entirely rewritten to make Pétain the absolute dictator of the Vichy regime. The motto changed from Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, which is liberty, equality, and brotherhood, to Travail, Famille, Patrie, work, family, fatherland. How very fascist. The country took a hardline religious, specifically Catholic stance, as well as putting emphasis on French identity and ethno-nationalism. An internal secret police known as the Milice Française monitored the nation, as well as censoring basically everything and most personal freedoms, like press, speech, and opinion, which just kind of virtually disappeared. However, anti-Semitic laws were also enacted. As part of their collaboration with Germany, Jews in Vichy France lost their citizenship and were actively persecuted, often detained and sent off to labor camps or killed. It's unknown to what extent Pétain actually believed in anti-Semitism and how much of it was self-preservation, but he did nothing to prevent it from happening. After the war ended, France was liberated and restored to a democratic republic. Vichy France ceased to exist, and all of the totalitarian laws and systems it made as well. Now it was time for justice. Pétain was put on trial, as well as all the other Axis collaborators during the war. By this time, he was well into his 80s, pushing 90, and his age was definitely showing. In late 1945, Pétain was put on trial by the French court for mainly treason against the French nation and its people. They said that he sold them out and that he was a fascist traitor, to which he stayed silent and showed little emotion at all. The court ruled that he was guilty on just about every charge, sentencing him to death. However, he was shown mercy since executing an 89-year-old war veteran was a bit barbaric and unnecessary, since he was probably gonna croak anyway. Get it? Because frogs, and also French people. He was stripped of all his military titles, other than the Marshal, and was sent to live on the last remaining years of his life privately in a fort. He was flown out to Île-d'Yeu, I think, which is this small island off the northwestern coast of the country. On that island was a large fort-like castle thing which Pétain was exiled to, and as such got some citadel fun in before his death, because who wouldn't? By 1947, he was hella old and suffering from all sorts of maladies, like onset dementia, incontinence, and vivid hallucinations. He needed round-the-clock care from nurses for him, and was eventually ruled as being utterly senile. After 5.5 years of suffering, he died in 1951. Well, that's it for this video, everyone. I hope you're all doing amazing, and I hope you all enjoyed that video. I do plan on getting the Canada video out next time, whenever that may be, which I am not going to give any specific time ranges on because I don't want quoted on that, because I know that's what's going to happen, so I'm going to try and prevent that. Anyways, this video was a blast to make, and I'm really glad to get back into the swing of things here. I'm going to try to start making videos again, but you never know with today's social, political climate. Those words have nothing to do with this, it's just something that everyone says, so now I'm going to say it too.